if I'll move on now to Dr. Matt Raven. Matt is also a member of the Mortimer History Society. Indeed, was the joint runner-up of our essay prize in 2017. And Matt is now an early career fellow in the Department of History at the University of Nottingham. And his prize-winning essay on Roger Mortimer, the second Earl of March, was published in the Mortimer History Society Journal, Volume 2. This afternoon, Matt is going to be talking to us about Edward III and the Lords of the Welsh March, Power and Privilege. So over to you, Matt, if you'd like to share your screen, please.
Great, thanks, Philip. Thank you for the introduction. And I hope my talk will fit quite well into the broad canvas that David has sketched for us. So I'm going to talk about, I suppose, Edward III and the March of Wales, and provide a sort of more specific, localized account of the dynamics that David so revealingly laid out for us. So the Welsh marches in the middle decades of the 14th century seem to be politically stable. We certainly do not see huge upheaval like we do when we look at the conquest of northern Wales under Edward I, the collapse of Edward II's kingship, or the dramatic events of Glyndwr's revolt at the end of the century. Nonetheless, Edward III's reign between 1327 and 1377 reshaped the Welsh March in some crucial ways. So we will examine this reshaping, paying particular attention to governance and the issue of law and order. Law and order and the march may not at first sight seem subjects that are easily reconciled. We might, for example, quote Rhys Davies, the great historian of the march. That's indeed Sir Rhys Davies. For of course the marcher lordships were not subject to the king's common law, except in the review of judicial errors. Instead, each lordship was a self-contained judicial unit. Each marcher lord was the final arbiter of justice within his own lordship. But royal governance, as Rhys Davies then showed, need not be a barometer of effective governance. And lordship, even marcher lordship, did not necessarily work against the kings of England if they managed the march well. And nor indeed was lawlessness a problem limited to the march when Edward III came to the throne, as is indicated by even a cursory glance at the literature of both England and Ireland under Edward II. So this paper will explore how Edward III managed the March of Wales, not, as Henry VIII later did, by importing English structures, but by working with the grain of noble power and ensuring the lords of the march were lords integrated into his vision of kingship. The historian T.B. Pugh noted that before the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, most of the great Welsh marcher lordships belonged to a small group of English magnates. The concentration of lordships into the hands of a few immensely powerful English families was a product of the 14th century. Demography and the interlinked geography of lordship are important for our purposes today. By 1330, when, as Hugh mentioned, the Edward III seized personal power, the ranks of marcher lords had been depleted. In 1314, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Lord of Glamorgan, had been killed at the Battle of Bannockburn. Glamorgan, which was estimated to be worth nearly £1,300 per annum, was settled on Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1317. And this Hugh's entry into marcher society threatened Roger Mortimer of Wigmore and Humphrey Bohun, Earl of Hereford and Lord of Brecon, and subsequently plunged the Southern March into violence. In 1322, Roger Mortimer of Chirk was imprisoned and was forced to surrender Chirk to Edmund, Earl of Arundel and Lord of Oswestry. In 1326, both Arundel and Despenser were executed by Mortimer and Isabella when they removed Edward II from his throne. Mortimer of Chirk, meanwhile, died in prison the same year, and his son never regained custody of Chirk. And of course, as members of this society know better than anyone, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore's Marcher Empire too fell in 1330, when he was subjected to forfeiture and execution. By the time Edward III removed Mortimer, there had been, therefore, 15 years of turmoil among the greatest families of the March. This presented opportunities. Edward had the chance to shape the Welsh March by distributing lordships which had been forfeited to the crown, and he had the power to restore those he wished to restore or deny the claims of those, such as the heir of Roger Mortimer of Chirk, he had reason to deny. In 1330, John Bohun, Earl of Hereford and Essex, held the great lordship of Brecon, which had been restored to him after Edward II's fall, and he styled himself appropriately as Earl of Hereford and Lord of Brecon. John seems to have been bodily infirm and suffered from some sort of disability, and he died in 1336. However, his titles and lands passed to his younger brother Humphrey, who, whilst also suffering from some sort of infirmity, was far more active than John and lived until 1361. So the great lordship of Brecon was in the hands of its natural lords, and Edward did not need to restore them at the start of his personal rule. By contrast, the king made an active decision regarding Richard FitzAlan, the son and heir of Edmund, Earl of Arundel. The cycle of execution and forfeiture between the families of Arundel and Mortimer of Wigmore was completed in 1331, when Richard FitzAlan was restored to his father's title of Earl of Arundel by the king and thus received Oswestry, which Mortimer had forfeited on his fall in 1330. Furthermore, Arundel was soon granted the valuable lordship of Chirk, which was immediately west of Oswestry. Possession of these lordships made Arundel a powerful force in the Northern March. And this largesse doubtless owed something to the friendship between Arundel and the king. They were around the same age, and Arundel had already spent time as a youth in the royal household. Two of the great English commodore families, Bohun and FitzAlan, were therefore secured in their possession of important marcher lordships, and they were joined by a newcomer to the March in the person of William Montague, perhaps Edward III's greatest friend in the first portion of his life. He was granted the lordship of Denbigh in North Wales, worth over £1,000 as a reward for his service to the king. And at a stroke, Montague went from a mere banneret of the royal household to a great marcher lord. Another opportunity for a distribution of lordship came with Edward III's custody of the heir to the Earldom of Pembroke, right in the southwestern corner of Wales, Lawrence Hastings, who was then 10 years old in 1330. Hastings' lordship of Abergavenny was leased to Henry of Grosmont, heir to the Earldom of Lancaster and another of Edward III's closest friends. And by 1339, Hastings himself was high in royal favour, and most importantly, he was allowed to assume the title Earl of Pembroke with the prerogative and honour of Earl Palatine. The positioning of those close to the king as forces in the March continued through the 1340s and 1350s. And the most notable instance, of course, came in 1343, when Edward of Woodstock, the king's son and heir, was made prince of a reconstituted Principality of Wales. This was done, as we might expect, with great ceremony. The prince was invested in the Easter Parliament of 1343, while seated with a coronet on his head and a gold ring on his finger and holding a silver rod. Huge swathes of northern and central Wales were now under the direct lordship of the prince, and furthermore his position could have been interpreted as one of overlordship over the whole March, as well as the lands of the Principality. And we will discuss what this means for the Marcher Lords shortly. But meanwhile, in 1347, Ralph Stafford received the lordship of Newport after the death of Hugh Audley. His father-in-law. Stafford was another man closely linked with the king and had previously been steward of the royal household. In that same year, royal support enabled Arundel to secure part of the Warenne inheritance, including the lordships of Bromfield and Yale, and added to nearby Chirk and Oswestry, just to the south, these gave him a huge territorial block in the Northern March. And finally, for our purposes here, demographically speaking, there was a series of hugely important and controversial judgments in the mid-1350s, which further reorientated the landscape of lordship in the March. After a long legal process, Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and yet another of the king's most trusted companions, was awarded the lordship of Gower in South Wales. He had acquired the lordship of Elfale in 1337 by marriage, but Gower was a far richer prize and heralded the entry of yet another great English comital house into the top tier of Marcher lordship. Thereafter, Thomas styled himself Earl of Warwick and Lord of Gower. And importantly, the king's wishes probably influenced the court judgment in Warwick's favour. The king certainly influenced a far more arbitrary decision concerning the fortunes of the families of Mortimer and Montague. The first William Montague, Edward III's great friend, had died in 1344. The young Roger Mortimer, grandson of the first Earl of March, had already received some of the traditional Mortimer inheritance by this point. He was, for example, already Lord of Wigmore. But in the 1350s, he enjoyed a meteoric rise, which culminated in the reversal of the forfeiture imposed on his grandfather and the royally approved recovery by Mortimer of the great lordship of Denbigh from William Montague II. And a series of royal charters guaranteeing Montague's rights were disregarded here in favour of a reconstituted Mortimer patrimony. And only the Earl of Arundel, in fact, was favoured enough to keep hold of a former Mortimer possession, which he did by contracting a series of agreements with Mortimer, including a marriage, giving him continued possession of Chirk. So two things are perhaps most notable about this reshuffling of Marcher lordship in both the northern and the southern March. First, all of these lords were closely involved in Edward III's kingship and enjoyed strong personal relations with him. Secondly, as Davies emphasised, in the 14th century, Marcher lords, to quote him, were lords of the March, but they were also, and often more self-consciously, barons of England. The March had become much more clearly the land of the top people of English politics. And Edward III's reign was a particularly important phase here. The reshaping of Marcher lordship outlined above thus integrated the Marcher lordships into a wider complex of noble power. So, why did Edward III do this? What did this offer him? Well, it placed much of the March into the hands of those whose abilities he trusted. And I think we can tie this reshaping in with Edward III's attitude towards his dominions more broadly, as David has explored, not necessarily as a conscious Anglicisation of the March, but as a mode of governance built on private power. So Edward III's reign is famous for war. It should also be famous for law. In England, for example, royal law was extended into the localities by the commissions of the peace and justices of jail delivery. Now, southern and midland England were well suited to governance by royal commission. But justice in the March, of course, came from the person of the Lord, not the person of the king. The lords of the March held regalitas, which we might translate perhaps as autonomy, in a way they did not in the heartlands of England, or indeed in Ireland. The mediums of lordly governance varied substantially from lordship to lordship. The pioneering work of Davies and others into the disparate mass of unpublished court records have allowed something of the texture of governance within the March to be discovered. So what mechanisms of law and order was Edward III vesting in his lords of the March? Well, courts proliferated in the lordships of the March, and in the March, English and Welsh tenants might be obliged to attend different courts, as in Bromfield and Yale, for an example. Some of these courts were based on Welsh customary courts, and some were imported from English practices. These courts were more than just judicial forums in the way we tend to think of courts today, courts in modern society. They offered more general instruments of governance par excellence. The exercise of judicial lordship was regular to the point of being relentless, in fact. In the lordship of Dyffryn Clwyd, held by the Grey family, as many as 136 court sessions were held in the lordship in 1 year. So a vast range of business, from the registering of title deeds to the prosecution of felonies, was conducted before the courts. And large numbers of people were required to appear before the court as litigants, as pledges, and as jurors. And every such appearance legitimised and indeed constituted lordship. And this multiplicity of judicial events was usually headed by a superior court, presided over by the Lord's Steward. In the lordship of Bromfield and Yale, a survey made in 1391 records that twice a year the steward should carry out a tawn, i.e. a session of the court, at which tawn all tenants and other residents ought to come except religious persons, clerics and women. And these sessions were held at Holt Castle, the central architectural embodiment of the Lord. In the Plantagenet of Pembroke, the Lord's tenants were bound to attend a court at the castle gate of Pembroke for certain pleas. And furthermore, twice a year, the Sheriff of Pembroke held courts within the various lordships of the Plantagenet and took those indicted before him to Pembroke Castle for judgment. The scale of such governance placed at the hands of the Marcher Lords is indicated by the revenues which accrued from it. On an individual basis, these may not at first seem particularly important, perhaps, for a magnate whose income exceeded £1,000 yearly, the equivalent of a multi-millionaire. To take one example, in the Montague Lordship of Denbigh, the court of the manor of Kilford was estimated to yield 3 shillings and 4 pence per annum. But of course, the Marcher Lords held many courts, and some of these brought in sizable total revenues. In the Arundel Lordship of Chirk, in the decade before the Black Death, the profits of the Lord's courts brought in an average sum which easily exceeded £100 per annum. An extremely valuable set of receivers' accounts for the great Bohun Lordship of Brecon shows that the Lord's receiver was charged to collect over £930 in 1350 to 51, and over £950 in 1352 to 3, just from the profits of the Lord's chief court and the lordship. And we should remember, I think, that these huge sums are being levied from a population that had been reduced by at least 25% and perhaps as much as 40% by the Black Death. The Lord's central courts are of particular relevance to our purposes, for they allowed the Lords of the March to preside over the legal pluralism inherent in Marcher society and to demand that even their greatest local vassals should appear in their courts and abide by their decisions. This was how Humphrey Bohun, Lord of Brecon, consolidated his authority over his vassals in the middle of the century. In 1349, he issued inquiries in his court at Brecon Castle, which brought to heel the lords of Penselly, Bronlees, and Cantref South. In particular, Sir Philip ap Rhys, Lord of Cantref South and Talgarth, who had claimed virtual autonomy, had to appear in Bohun's own court and acknowledge a series of rights which Bohun held over him. And the record of these proceedings suggests that Humphrey Bohun himself presided over the opening of these court sessions against ap Rhys. And this assertion of his rights as overlord forced local potentates to acknowledge Bohun's supremacy. In 1356, the Earl of March was asserting his authority in his lordships in a similar way. Grimbold Poncefort of Crickhow, Mortimer's most important local vassal, was forced to come to court and pay a fine of £100 for exceeding his judicial rights and for retaining a man outlawed in Mortimer's own court. In England, the Royal Judicial Heir, which is EYRE, a large and powerful judicial commission, offered a juggernaut medium of royal justice. In Wales, marcher lords too began to hold heirs. Significantly, these seem to have become a common feature of justice in numerous marcher lordships during Edward III's reign. They were able to hear all pleas brought before them and to inquire into all breaches of the lord's rights and breaches of his peace. They were, among other things, extremely valuable to the lord, both in terms of the fines they could bring in and because they were often only halted by communal payments which could total huge sums, such as the £1,800 proffered by the men of Brecon to halt an heir in 1375. The first such heir recorded in the well-documented lordship there came in 1349. It was around this time that heirs seem to have proliferated. In the lordship of Denbigh, there were 4 heirs between 1359 and 1370. In Bromfield, we know that great heirs were held at Holt in 1344 to 5 and 1346. Another was held after the death of the Earl in 1347. In the Principality of Wales, a series of heirs was initiated from 1345. And significantly, I think these were paralleled by large judicial inquiries across the English border. In 1353, perhaps most notably, the Prince of Wales proposed to hold a general heir in Cheshire, which was halted by the promise of a payment of 5,000 marks by the local community. A mark, by the way, is 2/3 of a pound. He was accompanied during his visit to Cheshire at this time by 2 English lords, Henry of Grosmont and Ralph Stafford, both of whom we have met earlier, and both of whom held marcher lordships. Edward III's marcher lords ruled, therefore, lordships which were units of governance. And they were not just interested in governance in the March. In the 1340s and 1350s, many of the English lords who were also marcher lords were highly active in governance within England itself. They headed panels of justices of the peace and, after 1351, commissions charged with enforcing the statute of labourers, intended to regulate the lower orders of society in the wake of the Black Death. They acted as triers of petitions in the King's High Court of Parliament, as prominent members of the House of Lords, and as part of the King's Council. And their rule in the March, and particularly their holding of heirs, paralleled these activities. It also paralleled Edward III's, I think, own approach to law and order in northern England. Notably, Edward III made sure that great liberties within England were held by those whose abilities he trusted. The great Plantagenet liberty of Durham was ruled successively by Bishop Richard Berry, the King's former tutor, and Bishop Thomas Hatfield, former keeper of the Privy Seal, an administrative officer who had worked closely with the King himself. Perhaps most akin to the replication of a marcher lordship within England was the creation of the Duchy of Lancaster in 1351, which saw Henry of Grosmont, already someone we have met, invested for life with extensive liberties in the county of Lancashire. So, by influencing the personnel of marcher lords, Edward III was able to harness the marcher lordship into the wider activities of the English nobility. And the March of Wales was, of course, very different from much of England. But the dynamic of noble governance was, I think, a transnational one, and one which goes some way to explaining Edward III's own attitude to the March. Wales was unique, but not, in this instance, wholly exceptional. And this may be why Edward was often happy to affirm the position of the marcher lords, rather than seeking to erode their autonomy. In 1331, for instance, during the minority of Lawrence Hastings, heir to the Eldum of Pembroke, Lawrence's guardians complained to the king that royal writs were being heard in the Plantagenet in contravention of the young Earl's rights there, because the only writs which should have been circulating should have been in the Earl's name. Lawrence was not presumably old enough to have curried favour with Edward. He was 11 at this time. But nonetheless, the king responded that these royal writs should be repealed. When the autonomy of the Plantagenet was again threatened after Lawrence's premature death in 1347, Edward III responded by proclaiming that he wished that the lords of Wales, their ancestors had used them in the time of his predecessors, and there should be nothing new done to the contrary. This suggests that Edward III had little interest in reducing the rights associated with the March. And perhaps the most notable insight into Edward's attitude to the March of Lords can be gained by examining the position of the Principality of Wales in the late 1340s and 1350s. As we have heard, there was some ambiguity in the terms of the Black Prince's Charter of 1343, for he had been granted not only the lands of the Principality, but all other crown possessions in Wales. And the Prince, as David could very much tell you, was not someone who tolerated ambiguity regarding his rights easily, and the open question of which lordships pertained to the Principality was explored, if not necessarily by the Prince himself, certainly by his council. The great lordship of Denbigh, held, as we have heard, by the Earl of Salisbury, was thrown into an inheritance, a minority, in 1344 when the first Earl died. William Montague Jr., the Earl's son and heir, was at this point a youth of 16, and there was some initial confusion as to whether the lordship should be taken during his youth into the hand of Edward III, or whether it should go to the Prince in accordance with his princely position in Wales. In the end, Montague was given possession of Denbigh by the Black Prince, and not the King, for an annual payment of 550 marks. And this arrangement does not seem to have aroused immediate controversy. But a greater degree of friction can be detected in the relationship between the Prince and Humphrey, Earl of Hereford, and Lord of Brecon, Huntingdon, and Heir, very much an adult and very much determined to consolidate his lordship in the March, as we have seen. In the mid-1340s, Humphrey petitioned the king for the return of the lordship of both in the Middle March, currently held by the Black Prince, which lay in a strategic position adjacent to both the Principality and immediately north of his lordship of Brecon. Bohun said he should have both as part of his inheritance. He said that he had presented legal evidence to the Royal Council, and nothing was found which contradicted this claim. But nothing had then been done to deliver his inheritance to him, because the Prince wanted to keep the lordship for himself. The Earl then clearly took matters into his own hand. The Prince complained that his officials in Bluth were being obstructed by Bohun's men. And Bohun was further aggrieved by the Prince's attitude to Brecon itself, which had never, by any stretch of the imagination, been held of the Principality of Wales. We have seen how the Earl reinforced his autonomy in Brecon by holding heirs, and that he was not alone in doing this at this time. The Prince, however, wrote an extraordinary letter to the Earl at some point in the late 1340s, demanding that the Earl cease holding sessions of the heir, which the Prince considered to infringe his rights as Prince of Wales. Bohun's reaction to this extraordinary and unprecedented demand relating to his own affairs in his own lordship can be guessed by the fact that he continued to hold heirs into the 1350s. In effect, he relegated this letter into his junk mail. And it was not just in Brecon that the Prince and his council attempted to assert new and controversial rights. A protracted dispute over the position of the Prince came in 1347, when Earl Warenne, Lord of Bromfield and Yale, died. He was survived by his Countess, Joan, but Richard, Earl of Arundel, had also secured a substantial portion of the Warenne inheritance for himself as Warenne's cousin. The Prince seized control of Bromfield and Yale after Warenne's death and granted possession to the Earl of Arundel. But Joan exploited the uncertain constitutional position of the lordship to gain possession of Bromfield and Yale by grant of the king, Edward III. It was unclear which of these grants, one by the Prince, one by the king, should take precedence. and Arundel had to come to a private agreement with Joan, which gave him possession of the lordship, but only in return for a pension totaling £900. Tension over these assertions of superiority in the March and the confusion as to the place of the prince vis-a-vis that of the king in the March was addressed in 1353. Both Arundel and William Montague came to the Palace of Westminster on the 24th of October. They were joined by the prince and by Edward III himself. Arundel and Montague then did homage to the king and not the prince for their lordships of Bromfield and Yale and Denbigh respectively. And pointedly, they were to hold their lordships of the king in chief as immediately subject to his crown of England, the prince consenting to this. The king, therefore, was confirmed as their overlord. And this principle was generalised in the Parliament of April 1354 through the promulgation of a royal statute. The following year, though, the issue was replayed concerning the status of the lordship of Montgomery in the Middlemarch, recently acquired by the resurgent Mortimer, Earl of March, as part of his grandfather's inheritance. Mortimer argued that this lordship should be held by him without any render to the Black Prince. And before the royal court of the King's Bench, the prince's attorney conceded that Montgomery was held freely by the Earl and not from the prince. Finally, the prince also asserted a right to the important lordship of Gower, which the Earl of Warwick had received with the aid of the king. The prince pursued his right to this lordship in the royal court, claiming that Gower was not a martial lordship, but instead part of the principality. In the end, the king held broker an agreement between the Earl and the prince that saw Warwick confirmed as Lord of Gower with full rights, with reservation only to the King of England, in line with the statute of 1354 you see before you. Once again, Edward's own attitude, Edward III this is, Edward's own attitude and input proved decisive in the fortunes of a martial lordship, as he helped Warwick fend off the claims of the Black Prince. So, Edward reshaped the March. He positioned a group of nobles whose abilities were proven to him as martial lords through an extensive series of grants and restorations. And what this, I think, in effect did is tied martial lordship more closely with English kingship. And Edward II's reign had showed what could happen if this was not the case. And Edward III took steps to rectify this situation. And these grants can be seen as the patronage of the favoured, for royal favour was key both to the rise and the decline of many marcher families in the 14th century. But they should also, I think, be tied into governance in both the March and beyond. Lordship in the March entailed responsibilities as well as lucrative opportunities, for it was the complex processes of justice as well as their profits which Edward III was investing in his martial lords. He thus worked to retain the powers of governance associated with martial lordship, which were exercised most directly through the dense network of courts presided over by the martial lords. He wanted these powers to work effectively, which presumably is why Edward III confirmed the autonomy of the martial lordships, even against the claims of his son and heir. And not only did he want them to work effectively, but he wanted them to work for people he knew to be effective as leaders and as nobles. And furthermore, his attitude to the Welsh marches suggests that the king saw the march as part of a wider jurisdictional landscape he sought to order to his liking. He enabled the march to be governed not as we, looking back, might expect by the expansion of the power of the royal state, but through the workings of martial lordship. It is this dynamic which enables Edward III's March of Wales to be understood as David has understood it in the first talk, as part of his broader Plantagenet world. The king restored what he considered to be law and order in his realms through both aristocratic and royal governance as circumstances and political geography dictated. In Ireland in the 1340s and 1350s, he restored and confirmed the liberty rights associated with the Irish earldoms, which offered the best medium for English rule to be effective on the ground. In England, he bolstered both royal, particularly in the Midlands and the South, and aristocratic justice, particularly in the North, where he could. Rhys Davies noted what he called the almost embarrassing diversity of the March. Wherever he continued, we touch March a history, it seems to disintegrate into plurality and to defy the analytical categories of the historian. The March was, of course, different in so many ways, but it also formed part of what historians of the British Isles, such as Peter Crooks, Brendan Smith, and indeed David Green, have come to call a Plantagenet empire, an empire with the power of aristocratic lordship at its very heart. And understanding this is perhaps why Edward III was able to rule the Welsh March and the Welsh Marcher lords with such success.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry, particularly that sort of just last part of your talk just gave me so much to think about. And because yes, I think one of the interesting questions, is the sort of attitudes of different monarchs to the powers of the Marcher lords, and the extent to which they sort of tried to curb them or coexist. And I think that's quite fascinating, the insights in terms of how Edward III managed and worked with the realities of the powers of the Marcher lords.
Yes,
because of course it always seems to me that his grandfather, Edward I, was slightly schizoid in modern parlance. Because on the one hand, after 1284, creating new Marcher lordships, but at other times trying to rein in and confine the powers of the Marcher lords.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas I mean, what's coming out of your talk is the extent to which Edward III accepted the power of the Marcher lords and harnessed that to his aims.
Yes, I think the 14th century is great, really, because you have four kings who contrast quite nicely in their approach to the March and indeed to Ireland to an extent. I certainly think you're correct that I think Edward I and Edward III were similar in lots of respects, but I think Edward III was perhaps more flexible and more understanding of some of the realities of power on the ground in the regions away from southern and Midland England than Edward I was at times. And I think Edward III's great strength is to be able to accept that dynamic and capitalize on it, and to, as you say, sort of harness it through an adroit management of personnel, rather than seeking to sort of radically change the nature of power in the March and by attacking liberties and jurisdictions. I also think with Edward II's reign, in between them, the need perhaps to accept the deep-seated localism and place of lordship in the March had been emphasised to a very great degree. And I wonder if you swapped Edward I and Edward III around to the other side of Edward II's reign, perhaps Edward I might have been more cognizant of the dangers of getting the March wrong. So I think Edward II's reign is key in shaping the next 50 years.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Matt. Right, I said I would start with a question from Patrick McDonough, to which I want to add a supplementary question, Matt. So Patrick's question is that it relates to the lordship of Montgomery. Did the Black Prince resurrect the question of his ultimate authority over Montgomery during the minority of Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March. As Edmund's Receiver General in 1375, 20 years on from this, he would pay the Black Prince's Receiver General money for the farm of Montgomery. So that's Patrick's question, as to whether the Black Prince resurrected the question with ultimate authority. My supplementary question to that is whether we know at what point the Mortimer hold on Montgomery transitioned from being a gift for life to hold for life during the reign of Edward II and Isabella, to one in which it was a Mortimer hereditary lordship.
Well, both of those questions afraid I will have to hedge slightly. To take your one first, Philip, I will look at my proper notes on things, and I can email you, but I suspect the logical time off the top of my head would have been probably in the 1350s, when Roger Mortimer surges in the king's regard. And we do certainly see one of the ways Edward III likes to show favour to people like Roger Mortimer is to make lands that they hold for life into hereditary tenures, because that's a really good way of rewarding someone without actually having to find new things to give them. But whether that happens in the 1350s, I'm not 100% sure about checking. Although I do think that happens with some of Mortimer's other lands and acquisitions. Another thing that sometimes happens is that a monetary rent will be commuted to the rent of something like a sparrowhawk, or a sort of either a joke or a nominal rent, and I think it would fall into that sort of category. Patrick's question, I suspect Patrick will know the answer better to me. I presume the receiver's accounts are something he knows very well. It does seem then that what we have at play here is obviously not just a question of legality and set in stone rights, but also a question of a power dynamic. And in the 1350s, Roger Mortimer and the king have, I suppose, the power dynamic on their side, or at least the king enables Mortimer to have the power dynamic on his side. Obviously, that wasn't necessarily the case after Edward III's death, or in the minority of the third of the later Earls of March. If, as Patrick says, and he would know, this farm is being paid to the Black Prince, then that does suggest that indeed the situation flipped once again as the power dynamic shifted. And I suppose that sort of underlines the centrality here of having an adult lord, but also having links with royal power and royal favour, and being able to use that to your advantage. Because what we see is how there is always a claim, and rights are very rarely set in stone so much that they can be completely uncontestable, and it's a constant process of renegotiation. So from what Patrick is saying, it sounds like that was again renegotiated later in the century. So I completely agree, Patrick.